Well, joining us here in the studio is Chris Hedges. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, best-selling author and former Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. Chris, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Obviously, we've been hearing there what's been happening in the UN Security Council, and the US has repeatedly vetoed 4 times now, and 1 in absentia, even when it's a watered-down version. Why is that?
Because of the power of the Israel lobby, which owns Congress, but politicians like Joe Biden, who receive more money from the Israel lobby than any other senator. I think he still holds that record, even though he hasn't been in the Senate for over a decade. So that's why. I think what's interesting, and maybe you want to bring that up on the vote today, the resolution to deny arms, you've certainly seen a backlash. And that's what's new, and that's what's significant. But that old generation, that Biden generation, they are bonded at the hip with Zionists, and that's how you have Anthony Blinken, a Zionist, or Hochstein or others who served in the IDF, essentially running around the Middle East, handling Middle East policy. And
it can be very confusing for lots of our viewers who've been following the war very closely. You're seeing, as you mentioned, that Anthony Blinken, shuttle diplomacy, moving and traveling between Israel, here, even in Qatar, for the mediation for those ceasefire talks. And then at the same time, so they're saying that they're pushing for this ceasefire all of this time, including Joe Biden back in April last year, who said that he was really pushing for this and clearly trying to do this before he was to leave the presidency. And then they veto in the UN Security Council.
Well, because for them, first of all, it's not a permanent ceasefire. It's a ceasefire in which the hostages will get out. And that becomes the raison d'etre for them vetoing the resolution at the UN. When in fact all of the hostages could have been freed on October 8th. Those hostages were taken to release the some 10,000 Palestinians who are held in Israeli prisons, many without due process under administrative detention. So they're really little different from hostages. And let's be clear, Israel holds women and children as well. So that was, and I think you could make a pretty strong argument that Israel has probably killed most of the hostages that have been killed. So that's an Israeli decision, but the U.S. uses that as a feint to essentially cover for Israel.
We heard there from the Israeli ambassador to the UN, Danny Danon, thanking the U.S., saying that that they're not abandoning those that are held captive, and said that the text of that resolution meant that the captives still being held in Gaza will be forgotten. But that's despite the families of those held captive actually accusing the Israeli government, as well as the Prime Minister himself, of abandoning the captives.
Yeah, it's not a secret in Israel, not only to the families of the hostages, but to the wider, or certainly much of the wider Israeli public. And that's why you've seen such large demonstrations in places like Tel Aviv, shutting down highways. I know you covered it. I mean, very large numbers. There's not a dispute, I think, over the genocide in Gaza. That has full-throated support. It's how they've handled the hostages and the callousness by which the Netanyahu government has just discarded them.
OK, thanks very much for joining us there, Chris Hedges, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and we'll be speaking to you shortly again.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.